story of High Street and Mill Street, which becomes Parnell Street, a street with a long history. If you look at the map here, you can see that it's a logical extension from Church Street, which was the original street heading back to the Priory. So down Church Street, through the Height, or later O'Connell Street, and then Mill Street follows the line of the river all the way out to the mills of Ennis on the outskirts of the town. Thanks to Brian O'Donnell, we know from his Atlas of Ennis that the earliest appearance of Mill Street on a map was in Henry Ellsworth's 1634 survey of Ennis, and was named as a street going by Henry Woodfin. It then appears on Molan's map 1703, unnamed, and just a short bit of it, and it's first named as Mill Street in the Registry of Deeds in 1732. Thanks to a wonderful bit of detective work by Brian O'Donnell, using his Corporation Book of Ennis, which he transcribed himself, we know where the original gate, a town gate on Mill Street, was in existence. From this 1752 entry in the Corporation Book, we find and present that the old ruined houses in Mill Street, near Mr. Kent's, are in such a dangerous situation in several parts thereof that not only the neighbours living near it, but travellers walking in the street by said buildings are in danger. We therefore find that all that of the said old ruined building that appears to be in danger be pulled down at the expense of the inhabitants of Mill Street. Now, O'Donnell reasons that there were people living over the arch of the gate, as is shown in Church Street on Molan's map, so that it makes sense that the falling masonry underneath would hit people passing by. So that establishes that there was a gate there. Now, where was it? Where was Mr. Kent's? Another entry in the Corporation Book in 1756 establishes that. It appears to us by the complaint of several of the inhabitants of the said borough that the lane opposite the house of Mr. Francis Kent, and known by the name of Connell's Lane, is so much out of repair that it is not safe for man or horse to pass that way, if not repaired. So that identifies opposite his house, which is marked as number 30, is Fahy's Lane. It's now known as Fahy's Lane. It was Connell's Lane, then as Fair Lane, and is now known as Fahy's Lane. So the town gate stood at House 40, which at modern time on Parnell Street is number 60, Enzo's Fast Food. This was confirmed by an entry in the Landed Estates Court concerning the sale of the property in 1862, with an accompanying map given the precise location. Now, not many houses from this early exist or are even recorded in any way. This house, Francis Kent's, was described in the Registry of Deeds as the large stone house in the street leading to the mills of Ennis, formerly known as Conway's Tenement. So we have a visual idea of the house. At some stage in the mid-19th century, this stone plaque was discovered in an unfortunately unidentified house in Mill Street that was being demolished. The plaque reads, "This house and the front was built and finished by George Stagpool, merchant, in the year Anno Domini 1687. George and his brother William Stagpool were from an old Dublin and Limerick merchant family, transplanted to Clare in 1652. George Stagpool and Francis Kent were contemporaries, serving together on Ennis Corporation. So the two houses may be the same house, or they may be different ones. The plaque was sent to Edenvale, the Stackpool 19th century house, and they presented it to Dysart Castle Museum in the 1990s. The house McParlin's on Parnell Street is known as the oldest inhabited house in Ennis, and is the only house of this period that is intact. It was inhabited until 2008, when it was declared structurally unsound, and the then inhabitant, Irene Clune, was required to leave, very much against her will. A project was then undertaken to protect and restore its historic fabric. The triple diagonally set stone Jacobean chimney and the gable were recorded, taken down, and stored. The ground floor was excavated, and its fireplace was found to have had at least 5 periods of use, the earliest dating to the construction of the gable about 1600. The fireplace was originally almost 2 metres wide and 1 metre deep, becoming progressively smaller over the centuries. The east gable was built of rubble stone, but the west and south walls were constructed of very large oak beams dated to 1672 through dendrochronology. The gable and the chimney were rebuilt using the original stones. Greater detail about this and photos can be found in an article in the Other Clare Journal, volume 36, by Ristardi Cronin and Frank Coyne. The name McParland refers to a late 19th century stroke first half of the 20th century family, nothing earlier than that. Pardon. But tradition has it that the house was the residence of the Reverend Dean James Barrett, whose chapel was just around the corner in Chapel Lane. In March 1800, a daughter, Harriet, was born in Ennis to travelling actors William Smithson and his wife. They left Ennis the following month, leaving Harriet in the care of Dean Barrett until his death in 1808. Harriet later became the wife of French composer Hector Berlioz, so maybe this famous person did live in the house, but there is no direct evidence of that. Now, to concentrate on High Street. Looking at this map, which is based on the Griffiths valuation maps of the 1850s, but is a slightly later version as Bank Place has been built, and it identifies each of the houses, it's clear that High Street started in what is now Abbey Street. From Hunts Lane, the first 3 houses there were regarded as High Street. The numbers then went across the mount to number 4, 4, 5, 6, and 7, then went across the street to 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, across Thompson's Lane to 13, 14, and 15. So High Street was more than what is known as High Street now. The name O'Connell Square was never referred to in the Valuation Office records or in either of the censuses, even though it was set up as O'Connell Square well before that. The first reference in the biographical notices in the Clare Champion was 1906, and they were rare until 1920s. The houses in High Street and the first few in Mill Street were higher than the water table dictated by the proximity of the river. Some, if not all of these houses, had cellars. Most of these were used for storage, but 2 of them, currently 6 and 7 High Street, were lived in. They were in the valuation books for the late 1850s and the early 1860s, Both these houses had the cellar valued separately from the house, and a named resident was given. Francis Walker was firstly in the cellar of number 6 and then moved to number 7 in 1682. He was named as a tinker in the church marriage records or as a tin plate worker in Slater's directory. He had 7 children, 4 of them born in High Street. The cellar had an earthen floor and a chimney, but the only natural light would have come from a heavy glass plate tile set into the footpath in front of the house, known as a vault light, which was pretty appalling sort of circumstances to live in. In my book, I did a chapter named the 3 Fs: famine, fire, and flood. The effects of the famine were not as immediate in a town like Ennis compared to rural areas, and newspaper reports were of the workhouse and relief schemes. But business was bad, the streets were full of people looking for food and shelter, and the fear of disease was pervasive. The drawing here of the widow Connor and her dying child in Fahey's Quay by James Mahoney in the London Illustrated News is very well known. Fahey's Quay, now known as River Lane, was opposite Fahey's Lane at the site of the old town gate discussed earlier. A less well-known story is that unearthed by historian Ciarán Ó Murchú of the unnamed stranger who appears to have been the last person to die of starvation in Ennis during the famine. And Ciarán Ó Murchú recorded it in his book Sable Wings Over the Land. The man put up in a very poor lodging house in Mill Street. After eating a bowl of stirabout, he paid the landlady for his bed and descended to the cellar to sleep. Next morning, as he was leaving, the landlady told him not to return, as she did not wish to have him in the house, in consequence of his appearing to be a very delicate man. However, he did return, and she relented. He told her that he had been at confession with the priest, who had given him a penny. He had some bread, and he gave the lady a penny halfpenny for his bed. She gave him back a penny to buy some milk, which he said he would do the next morning. At 10 o'clock the next day, he was found dead in his bed. Fire was obviously a constant danger in the 17th and 18th centuries, when so many houses were made of timber and thatch. Grappling hooks to pull down burning thatch and buckets of water were the only tools available. However, in the 19th century, even with houses made of stone and many with slate roofs, other fire dangers arose. Sorry, I've gone too far with that. In 1867, fire broke out at 1 and 2 High Street. This was in the store of seedsman and hardware merchant John Maguire. Among his stock was oil, turpentine, and gunpowder. By this stage, a fire engine was available in Ennis, something like this example, and was under the responsibility of a Michael Patterson of Mill Street. The fire engine arrived at High Street, and as did a large crowd. But because they were aware of the presence of gunpowder, as the newspaper report put it, considerable reluctance was exhibited by many in the crowd to render prompt and active assistance. So nobody else came to help. The fire engine had 3 pairs of hoses, but they burst almost immediately. The fire became more intense, and the gunpowder exploded, blowing off the roof of the house. The cause of this disaster was explained the following week. The water for the engine had been drawn up from the nearby river, but it was shallow at that point, and gravel was taken up with the water. The water should have been poured into the rear of the engine, where a grate prevented anything but water entering the engine. Michael Patterson should have been supervising, but he was holding the hose pipe directed at the building, as no one else had volunteered to help. The only person was a young Pat Maloney from Mill Street, who emptied the buckets of water into the space over the engine. The gravel was sucked into the hose pipe, which became choked and burst. House 3 was also badly damaged, and all 3 were demolished. Bank of Ireland bought number 3 and constructed a new building, which opened in 1874. Numbers 1 and 2 were also rebuilt, and for many years was Seymour's Medical Hall, now Gallagher's Eye Care Centre. The next serious fire was in 1878, and again was in a hardware store. This time it was in James Brady's 3-storey property on the other side of O'Connell Square. The fire took hold during the night in the shop where paraffin oil was stored and spread rapidly through the house. There was no escape except by jumping through the window, which all except his mother-in-law did. Her body was never found in the wreckage. An elderly aunt jumped, but was killed in the fall. Brady's 2 daughters jumped 15 feet and were severely injured. All the others in the house suffered relatively minor injuries. The house was totally destroyed, as was the wall of the next house. The fire brigade attended and managed to prevent the fire spreading to the houses adjoining in O'Connell Street. It wasn't until the 1920s that these houses were finally demolished and cleared and new buildings erected. Griffin's Drapery and McMahon's estate agents. So flooding. Flooding from the River Fergus was an historical problem for the town. This photo shows how close the houses in the lanes off the main street were to the river. This is not at Mill Street, but it is the same idea. 2 reports from the Clare Journal in the 19th century vividly describe the effects of flooding. This one from 1874. During the early part of Tuesday morning, a gale got up. The spring tide commenced to set in at 4 p.m, and as it gradually rose, the heavy swells gradually denoted the convulsed state of the River Fergus, which by 9 o'clock broke out over every bank and parapet around about Ennis, inundating the town to a depth of 18 inches in many parts, and flooding the houses and streets to such an extent as to cause loss and damage to traders and shopkeepers. Mill Street was a complete swamp from end to end, and inhabitants knee-deep in their dwellings. Or this later one in 1896, the incessant and heavy downpour of yesterday added materially to the already swollen state of the Fergus, and with a high wind with last night's tide, the water rose to an unusual extent, completely submerging the quays and lanes leading to them from Mill Street, while the latter thoroughfare was for some hours wholly impassable. The worst effects were experienced in some of the dwellings of the poor class in the lanes, the occupants of which were brought to a pitiable state, the waters entering to a considerable depth. Furniture and household utensils were washed about. In some cases, the beds were almost submerged. Mid-20th century memories of flooding recounted to me included the fact that houses in the lower part of Parnell Street would know that the floods were coming when their open fires began to fizzle out because of the damp rising. Flooding meant days without electricity, including houses not flooded. Some photos from the Clare Champion show, first of all, some good humour. The first one shows local shopkeeper Mrs. Frances Arthur being rescued on Christmas Day by the fire brigade. And of course, children will play no matter what happens. Some children anyway. But these photos to me just say misery. Mill Street and Parnell Street was always a street of trades and shops, big and small. This table, and I apologise for the small print, shows that those that changed and those that did not over a century and a half. It's based on the trade directories published in 1788, 1824, 1846, 1881, 1905, and 1943. Some of the differences would be due to varying emphasis by different publishers. How a shop or trade was named also varied over time. It might seem that there were no more publicans after 1881, but in fact, the name was changed to grocers and spirit dealers, and you can see that they continued in some number. What the table does show is the variety of activities that were carried on in the street over time. It was a very rare house where the occupants were simply living there without some business being carried out. This obviously brings me on to the people of Mill Street and Parnell Street. My book on the street, published by the Clare Roots Society, is primarily about the people who lived on the street. I started with the householders' names as listed in Griffith's valuation in the mid-1650s, right up to the 1970s when rates were abolished and the valuation office no longer recorded each change of occupier in an easily accessible format. Thereafter, a mixture of resources, including newspapers, death certificates, internet entries, and personal memories, filled out the picture. With 113 houses on Parnell Street and 15 on High Street, with very frequent changes of ownership and with large families often the norm, the number of residents involved must have numbered in the thousands. Most would only be identified by name, but some of the families had good stories to tell, which reflected the history of the times they lived in. I'm not picking out one family over another. Everyone spoke to me and emphasised how everyone had looked after one another and helped each other. It was the same refrain every time. There were many close relationships on the street, including many intermarriages, which caused a bit of problems when putting names together. Finally, I have a question. Why was a perfectly good name like Mill Street changed? The 1988 Local Government Ireland Act had effectively ended landlord control of local government. It was then the local Catholic and nationalist politicians who were making the decisions about their town. The 1908 to 1911 Ennis Urban District Council included 2 members from Mill Street. One was the chairman, Peter Keneally. In March 1910, the UDC decided to change the names of Church Street, Mill Street, and the Causeway. Fergus Street was suggested for Mill Street, but the memories of Charles Stewart Parnell, who had died in 1891, won out. The changes were made in time for the April 1911 census, and they continue to this day. Thank you.
Okay, that's it. That's great.